I'm here today on a lovely spring day in Columbus, Georgia again. Looking Chattahoochee River here. So the Chattahoochee River provides a really nice case study in something that is known as shifting baseline syndrome. And this is a concept that has been around for quite a while, but it's not nearly used as often in a fisheries context or a wildlife context until a little more recently. If you think about the fish that people catch here most, the ones that they target the most, the flathead catfish, the blue catfish, spotted bass, main bass you catch here, none of them are native here. You think about, what did people fish for here 100 years ago, or even 50 or 60 years ago? What did this place look like back then? What was the normal back then compared to the normal back now? If you've never heard of shifting baseline syndrome, it's a really interesting concept that has a lot of conservation applications, more as like an end game scenario. So buckle up, because we're going to talk a lot about that and dig into this concept.
Okay, so what is shifting baseline syndrome, and what in the world can it tell us about the future of black bass in this country? So before I get going on what shifting baseline syndrome is, I think we ought to recap where we are. This is a scorecard of black bass during the previous century. In the 1960s, red-eye bass, mostly the Coosa bass, were stocked in the numerous Cumberland Plateau streams in Tennessee, where they hybridized extensively with native smallmouth bass. In the 1970s, smallmouth bass were stocked in the hill country streams throughout much of in Texas, where they imperiled Guadalupe bass throughout much of their range, basically through introgressive hybridization. About the same time, Alabama bass were stocked in the Lake Lanier, where they quickly dominated the lake, and were soon afterwards moved into other North Georgia reservoirs, where they wiped out native smallmouth bass through hybridization. Shoal bass were also introduced in the Ocmulgee River around this time in Georgia, where they rapidly eliminated native Altamaha bass basically through competition. Alabama bass were then introduced in the Savannah River reservoirs in the 1980s, where they hybridized native Bartram's bass out of existence in these systems currently, basically through a combination of competition and hybridization. In the 1990s, Oklahoma stocked northern strain smallmouth bass into its reservoirs, basically because the native Neosho bass could not handle being in reservoirs, so they were, at that time, they were considered to be the same species. So they got fish from the northern part of the range and stocked them in there. They do fine in reservoirs. And they produced fisheries there, but they also moved up into the streams and rivers that fed these reservoirs and hybridized with native Neosho bass. If we move forward a little bit more recently, just since 2010, shoal bass were officially extirpated from Alabama. We found out that they had been eliminated from at least 60% of their native range throughout the Chattahoochee Basin. Below Atlanta, there are currently only 3 viable populations in tributary streams, and there are 2 fragmented populations below dams. Red-eye bass appear to be imperiled throughout much of their range, with the possible exception of Coosa and Tallapoosa fish. Altamaha bass, we mentioned already, we're gone now from the mainstem Ocmulgee River. In the mainstem Oconee, they're now under attack by hybridization from both non-native shoal bass and Alabama bass. The Chattahoochee and Bartram's bass have been extirpated from a lot of their range, especially the Chattahoochee bass. So neither one of these 2 species are doing very well. And in Alabama, the warrior bass has been largely hybridized out of existence by Alabama bass, and this time they're both native. So the scorecard is not all that great. Now, Moving to shifting baseline syndrome. This is a concept that was introduced by a scientist named Daniel Pauly. He's a fishery scientist out on the West Coast, and he noticed that, our understanding of the imperilment of the ecosystems around us are really defined by our own experiences. He defined it as a gradual change in accepted norms for the condition of natural environment. In other words, what we consider to be normal, healthy environment. The gradual change is due to a lack of past information. In other words, some kind of measurement of actual change. It's also due to the lack of experience of past conditions. Many taxa groups are frankly understudied, and black bass would totally fall into this. We know a lot about largemouth bass, a fair amount about smallmouth bass, and pretty much nothing about anything else. On a larger sense, the human impacts to the earth is really hard to grasp. Almost a quarter of all primary production across the globe is used for human consumption. About half of the world's wetlands are now gone. The wildlife populations worldwide have declined about 50%. These things are abstract to a lot of people, and quite frankly, even for me, I don't think about that very much. I'm a fisheries biologist who specializes in black bass in the southeastern United States. That is what I know a lot about. I don't think about worldwide where we are. And a lot of people don't, and often that means you reference personal and local anecdotes and examples as to what you think is going on in the environment. And that understates the changes that have occurred. So we don't have a lot of scientific data in a lot of cases that shows the change, and this is exacerbated by the fact that as a society we have a lot less interaction and familiarity with natural environments. People spend less time in nature. This is called the loss of interaction. And we also have a reduced level of natural history knowledge in our society. And this is called loss of familiarity. And that makes it very hard to accurately assess the environmental conditions. So if you look at the less loss of interaction here, this is from a study that has surveyed people in various age categories and how often they go, outside, not like outside their house, but go out into nature. And if you look at folks in their 20s, about half of them, that is monthly or less than monthly. It's a little more for folks in their 30s. 40s, it's still pretty low. It's not until you get in your 50s and 60s and 70s that people reported going out in the nature, almost three-quarters of them weekly or more often than weekly. So as time goes on, our society is getting less and less or having less and less interaction with nature. As far as the loss of familiarity, if you went to school back in the 50s and you were getting a biology degree, you had multiple natural history courses that you were taking. Nowadays, you're lucky if you have one. And so you may even get a biology degree and spend more time learning about genetics and uh, microbiology and general biology than you are about the world we're living in. And so this is just illustrating where we are in a society today. If you want to get down to brass tacks and see actual, how this affects fisheries, this is a really wonderful study from the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. That is the Gulf of California for all you who don't habla. But in Mexico, it's called the Sea of Cortez, which is a much cooler name than Gulf of California. It is the shoreline that lies along the mainland of Mexico and the Baja Peninsula. Baja Peninsula, if you've never been there to fish, it's a wonderful experience. It's basically bass fishing for grouper and mackerel and tuna. It's pretty amazing. But it's a very rural place. And there are, outside of a few places where the tourists congregate, much of the shoreline is either desolate or it's got small little communities there, a lot of whom don't even have running water or electricity. And they are fishermen, they are anglers, they are commercial anglers. So they ask these folks about how they perceive the fishing in the Sea of Cortez. And so the young folks, when they asked how many species did they think are depleted, they thought maybe on average one or two. Compared to that, the older folks said 10 to 12. How many sites were considered or mentioned as depleted? Again, the younger folks, maybe on average one, and the older folks, many more, four, five, six. Also telling is when they were asked how often, what proportion of their time do they spend offshore versus fishing offshore versus fishing near the shoreline, you see a very obvious declining trend as you get into the older groups, they fished near the shore much more often than the younger folks reported doing. And why is that? Well, it's simply because the shoreline fisheries are not as productive anymore, and you have to go offshore to get enough fish to feed your family, to have a successful commercial fishery. So older fishers noticed a higher number of species and sites depleted than younger ones, and they fish closer to shore. Um, both the numbers and sizes reported caught declined over time for all of these species. The middle-aged anglers had less understanding of past abundances. But what's amazing is that the very few young anglers even knew such species had ever been common. And this is striking because these results are from isolated fishing communities where you would think the chance of interaction or the opportunity for interaction across generations would be extremely high. And even then, there was this huge disparity as to how the older people viewed the environment versus the current environment versus the younger folks. Another very striking study, this is in China, in the Yangtze River fishing communities, about the Yangtze paddlefish, which has been declared extinct in 2020. Earlier than that, a study was conducted among communities living in the valley of the river where this fish was found. And we're going to boil it down to brass tacks. Simply, what percentage of anglers had ever heard of this? Okay, so by age group. Percent of anglers who had never heard of the Yangtze paddlefish, a fish that lives in the river where they fish and where they live. And if you're under 40 years old, high likelihood you'd never heard of it. If you were over 60 years old, you almost certainly had heard of it. You look at this on a more linear pathway, but based on the year they started fishing. If you fished before 1950, you almost certainly have heard of this fish and were familiar with it. If you started fishing in the 21st century, you'd have probably never had heard of it. And here's what makes this so amazing. This is not a small little minnow. This isn't a little obscure darter. This is a fish that got 12 feet long. This is a large megafauna of this river that bears the name of the river. And the younger people had still never heard of it, didn't know that such a fish ever existed. Yet it used to be a major animal in this river. So what are the implications? People have lousy memories. And what that means is that what's alarming to us today could be commonplace tomorrow. Intergenerational information transfer sucks. And it's not just in America. We don't listen to our elders, and our youngsters don't listen to us. We're in increasingly segmented societies. Young people hang together and do their thing. Middle-aged people hang together and do their thing. Older people hang together and do their thing. Even in societies where you would think that wouldn't happen. We have very little use or appreciation for history. A lot of us don't care what things were like 100 years ago, but it has great implications for the environment. And so, since we don't care about history, and frankly, in a lot of cases anymore, at least in this country, we don't care about science either, we use our own experiences as a surrogate for actual knowledge. What we see in our backyard is what's really going on in the world. And so our baseline, in other words, is the conditions that we had growing up. So the consequences, and I drew this kind of graph from a study as well. If you have a decline in natural environment, but it's not recognized, and the reason it's not recognized is we don't have the data to show it. As a society, we are losing interaction with the outside world anyway, and we don't even understand in a lot of cases what natural history is all about. You end up with a shifted baseline syndrome. You end up with shifting baseline syndrome. Your baseline is now shifted. And the consequences of this is we have an increased tolerance of degradation. Oh, the river's always been like this. We have an altered definition of what a healthy environment is. Look, that river's healthy. There's no fish kills out there. Everything's fine. And we can have inappropriate baselines for conservation. And what makes this worse is that means there's a feedback loop. Our increased tolerance of degradation, our altered definition of healthy environment becomes our new baseline. And then as the environment continues to decline, our baseline keeps shifting to where a degraded environment is acceptable. What does any of this have to do with black bass? I'm sure by now you're all wondering that question. I'm going to just use I'm going to use the same example that we started with, the Chattahoochee River flowing between Georgia and Alabama. There are only three native black bass in this system: largemouth bass, shoal bass, Chattahoochee bass. But spotted bass were put there sometime in the mid-50s, Alabama bass about 2 decades later, starting in Lake Lanier, and they've spread throughout the system here. We did a genetic survey across the basin, Atlanta to Columbus, Georgia. We collected 642 non-largemouth bass. Largemouth bass don't seem to hybridize with almost anything. So just looking at the non-largemouth bass, we had genetic data from 642 of them. Almost half of them were hybrids. Somewhere between the different tributary systems or the areas of the river, the range was somewhere between 15%, which is pretty good, to 91%, which is pretty horrific. So I'm going to just focus in on fish that look like Alabama bass from this study. This is the proportion of Alabama bass genes in that fish. So the fish down here on this end are spotted bass. The fish down on the right side are Alabama bass. Those are the only what we would consider pure fish in the whole study. And if you add that up, you're basically looking at about 25% of this massive number of fish were pure, either spotted bass or Alabama bass. 75% of them were hybrids. 75% of them were not a species. The question is, how many people alive today remember the Chattahoochee River when there were only largemouth bass, shoal bass, and Chattahoochee bass in the basin? I'm guessing none or very few. Well, what about other areas? What about Lake Lanier? How many people are alive today that remember that lake without Alabama bass in it? How about the Savannah River reservoirs? Same question. As a side note, when I was in school doing my master's degree in the early 90s, a friend of mine I went to school with at Virginia Tech was getting his at UGA, University of Georgia. He used to fish tournaments over on the Savannah River back then, and he remembers people weighing in 2 and 3.5 pound Bartram's bass in those reservoirs, along with all the other things they were catching. Those fish do not exist in those reservoirs in 2025. They're gone. And only people as old as him and me can remember when people used to catch them often enough that they could get weighed in a tournament. What about the North Georgia reservoirs? How many people today fishing those reservoirs have any knowledge of what they were like before Alabama bass got put in there, when it was just largemouth bass and smallmouth bass? What about the Ocmulgee River? That's a little more recent, but how many people remember the Ocmulgee River before shoal bass were put in there? Parksville Reservoir in Tennessee, Lake Norman in North Carolina. They both have had Alabama bass introduced right around the turn of the 21st century. We're already 20 to 25 years past introduction. How many more decades do we have before the generation that fished those reservoirs before with no Alabama bass are alive? The list goes on and on. So what does that mean for our understanding of black bass in the 21st century? The historical populations are generally unknown because they never were studied, so it's really hard to establish a baseline for most of these species. We know now that successive generations of anglers often fail to recognize change or comprehend even the historical conditions because we don't talk to our older folks or they don't talk to us. That knowledge somehow just does not trickle down. So you have to ask, how invested is the current generation in conservation actions for native black bass? There's a lot of concern for shoal bass right now because we're the generation fishing where these rivers, where shoal bass are, especially say the Flint, where they're the native species of choice. But how many more generations in the future will this be true? I'm going to leave you with this chilling quote from Daniel Pauly about the effects of shifting baseline syndrome. And he says, "We transform the world, but we don't remember it. We adjust our baseline to the new level, and we don't recall what was there." And the question is, and the question we should be asking ourselves, why do people accept this? And the answer is, again, very poignant. Because they don't know that it was ever different. Folks, I submit to you today that we stand on a precipice here in 2025. Some of our black bass are in dire straits, and others are heading that direction. This is a Chattahoochee bass. This is very likely going to be the first black bass species ever listed on the Federal Endangered Species Act. And I bet less than a quarter of the people who fish the Chattahoochee River or anywhere in that basin has ever heard of this fish, and probably less than 10% of them have ever seen one in their hand. How invested are they in this fish getting restored to some level of stability? It's hard to say. How many of the people fishing Lake Lanier and enjoying that unbelievably wonderful Alabama bass fishery know or care that those fish run up the Chattahoochee River and run up into the tributaries and are decimating this fish, this species? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But in the light of shifting baseline syndrome, the question we also should be asking is 10, 15, 20 years from now, will anyone care if this fish blinks off and goes away? I don't know the answer to that. But I submit to you that we should all be asking ourselves these questions, and we should all be interested in what the historical conditions were before we started moving bass all around.